a high-level delegation. And the second challenge that I have is that the Vice President of ASAF, who's representing the President of the Academy of Science of South Africa, is here, Professor Bani Pichana. Thank you very much. And the second challenge is that my boss, the Executive Officer of ASAF, Himla Sudial, is here. So I am doing an appraisal here. And the third challenge that I have is that my teacher, my supervisor for my PhD, Professor Pilani Moyo, is here. So I'm doing both a work appraisal and an academic appraisal, and also an ASAF high-level appraisal here by the Vice President. But I think I'll try. Let me try. This session that we have here today is hosted by the World Academy of Science, TWAS, the Sub-Saharan Africa Regional Partner, which is, in that map is called TWAS-SAREP, which is one of the 5 regional partners of TWAS, the World Academy of Science. And in this room today, we have got a lot of TWAS fellows. We also have a lot of TWAS young affiliates and beneficiaries of TWAS activities in terms of fellowships, grants, prizes, scientific meetings, and so forth that TWAS has been doing across this continent through the prominent scientists that live in this continent of Africa. TWAS-SAREP is hosted by the Academy of Science of South Africa, ASAF, hence the partnership, hence the relationship. So since 2015, TWAS-SAREP has been hosted by ASAF after it moved from the African Academy of Science. And by the corner there, that gentleman called Kolani, who's lifting up his hand, is the secretariat who does the day-to-day running of TWAS-SAREP, working together with me. That I have 2 hats that I wear. The first hat is that I'm the international and national liaison manager for ASAF, but also the coordinator of TWAS in Sub-Saharan Africa. That having been said, every year we look forward to Amasa, and the executive officer said to us that when it's time for Amasa, leave everything and let's go to Amasa, because we love Amasa, we support Amasa, we enjoy Amasa. Because besides the scientific program that starts tomorrow, there is this thing called the Learning Collaborative. It's a space where we learn from one another and use the capacity that is within the academies and beyond to select a particular topic so that we sharpen one another in what is called the iron sharpeneth iron, so that we can be able to do this work much more effectively and in partnership with one another. Today we're talking about what is called science diplomacy. And we have speakers that know a lot about this, who will share and will ask questions and will discuss. But in my work as the international liaison manager, I interact a lot with the SADC, where our academy is located. I also interact with the AU. And one question I've been asked is that why is there so much interest from the academies on the SDGs, which are top and global, but there isn't much, or there is little, according to those that asked me, emphasis on the national development plan of an individual country. Next step, the work of the REC or SADC in our case. Next step, the work of the AU in terms of the STIZA and the Africa we want, before we talk about the SDGs. So in other words, there's nothing wrong about the SDGs, but the route to the SDGs start from the National Development Plan, which we usually call science advice, where an academy does advise the government on national priorities. But when we begin to go out of our country to the REC level, to the AU, to the SDGs and other priorities, we begin to operate in what is called science diplomacy. That's a simplistic definition, but the rationale of this meeting is the fact that the continent is confronted with a number of transboundary and international as well as global challenges that require scientists as individuals, but also scientists as a collective, like Amasa and others, to begin to influence the foreign policy direction of countries as well as multilateral organizations like SADC and AU. 3 objectives before I give the speakers. We would like, number 1, to expose academies of science in Africa to key contemporary international policy issues relating to science diplomacy. Secondly, we would like to take stock of science diplomacy as a foreign policy tool and various forms that it takes. And lastly, to examine the actual and potential role of academies of science in fostering interregional dialogue and science and scientific cooperation. With those words said, I would like to introduce the first speaker. I will not read their bios, they are in this green book. So Peter McGrath is here all the way from the IAP as well as TWAS. He will discuss with us the first part of this session, which says, what is science diplomacy? And what is the role of science institutions and networks in this science diplomacy? Shall we put our hands together for Peter to come and speak to us?
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I was told there would be a pointer here, so I can operate the slides myself. So while that's arriving, okay, I see it coming. Let me just explain a little bit about myself. And I stood up here an hour ago and gave an introduction on behalf of IAP, the Inter-Academy Partnership. But like Stanley, who has 2 heads, I also have 2 heads. And the other part of myself has been looking after the TWAS Science Diplomacy Program that we started. Is this one? Okay, that we started in 2011. So science diplomacy itself is a relatively new term for an old concept. And I just wanted a quick show of hands, maybe, to see how many of you are familiar with the concept of science diplomacy. Okay. And how many of you have been familiar, let's say, for more than 5 years? So just a handful of it. Okay. So just to get an idea. Okay. So if this works, yeah. I think this is actually tomorrow's presentation. So yes. It should be called Amasa Science Diplomacy. No, the other one, that's this afternoon's. I'm talking a lot in the next couple of days. No, there should be three. We're looking for the third one. Yes, it's good. Okay, we've got it. So, what I'm going to do now, I've got about an hour to a bit less to introduce the concept of science diplomacy, but really put it in a perspective of sort of South-South relations. And goes this way. Okay. So this is, I'm going to start with a quote from Darrell Copeland, who's a Canadian former diplomat, who has said that despite many countries' massive expenditure on military resources, it's often the biggest expenditure in an annual budget, the major challenges facing the world today are things like climate change, emerging diseases, and poverty that cannot be solved by military intervention. And he proposes that science diplomacy is a part of the answer. So we're representing here academies of science. We're all very familiar with what science is. It's a knowledge system. It's very systematic. We test and try and explain predictions about the universe. It's a universal language. It should be neutral. It should not be laden with political views or judgments. It should also be rational, transparent, testable, a meritocracy. Of course, as we're standing here with merit-based academies of science representative, and peer-reviewed. This is sort of the pillar that upholds the scientific publications and the knowledge that we understand. Diplomacy, on the other hand, is very different. The definition here from Wikipedia: the art and practice of conducting negotiations between representatives of states. It usually refers to international diplomacy and the conduct of international relations, but we'll see it can also work sort of within countries at different levels and so on. And just a couple of quotes to lighten up the occasion here. It's been said that diplomacy is to do and say the nastiest things in the nicest way, or a diplomat is an honest man sent abroad to lie for his country. So, yeah. Are there any diplomats in the room? I apologize for this. Also, Winston Churchill here: diplomacy is the art of telling people to go to hell in such a way that they ask for directions. Or a very subtle one: the art of letting somebody else have your own way. But I think the idea here is that diplomacy is very much an art and not really, as we understand it, a science. And we come to Darrell Copeland, the Canadian again, and he's laid out this table of the real sort of differences between science and diplomacy. You can see one is about stability and balancing power, whereas science is all for change, updating knowledge, unleashing power. Diplomacy about conventions and supporting the conventional, whereas science is about experimentation. Science is tolerant to risks, relies on facts and data rather than tact and discretion and so on and so on. So essentially these are two different communities, two different ways of thinking, and often we see them as very separate and disjointed. And the idea of science diplomacy is to try and form a bridge. I mean, often this is a metaphor we use in our pictures on our slides, is an actual bridge, how to bring together these two communities. So going back, as I said, the concept of science diplomacy is very old. I'll show a couple of examples in a minute, but the sort of definition and the modern understanding of it really came about from the publication by the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, in this case, and the Royal Society. They sort of held a sort of brainstorming meeting in London in 2009 and published this little booklet in 2010. And the participants of that came up with the definition of 3 pillars of science diplomacy. It is, there are various other definitions out there, but this is, I think, the most widely used one and the most robust definition, if you like. So it talks about science in diplomacy, whereas science is able to inform foreign policy objectives with scientific advice. So we can think here, and I'll go through more examples as we proceed, but think here of the science that feeds into the climate change negotiations, for example. We can think of diplomacy for science, facilitating international science cooperation. So there, it's when really governments come together and they may support large infrastructures such as the Sesame synchrotron that's been built in Jordan. It has about 11 member countries and so on from around the Middle East. And then there is science for diplomacy, using science to improve international relations between countries. So perhaps when there are not strong relations between countries, sort of at the government level, the diplomatic level, scientists continue to work together and can often be that first bridge when relations improve, to have something that the politicians, the diplomats can build on using the sort of scientific relations that are already there. And an example that we use of this is the US and Cuba. And sort of AAAS, for example, as a non-governmental organization, have been able to work with Cuban scientists on topics of interest between the two countries, on marine science, fisheries, hurricanes, and so on, even if there was no official relations between the two countries at the higher levels. Okay. So, just to clarify though, science diplomacy is not, or standard, what we understand scientific cooperation, just working scientist to scientist, is not necessarily part of science diplomacy. So here you see the lines indicate published papers where authors have come from 2 different countries. So you see the connections are strong in Europe, very strong the US to Europe and so on, China, India, but much less so connected in Africa, and certainly very little connecting sort of south to south. So when just to say, the motivation for international science cooperation is to advance science. We want to advance the sort of knowledge bank. Whereas the motivation for science diplomacy is really to affect relationships. So we get back to this building relationship between countries, between constituencies. Okay, and why do we need science diplomacy? I've mentioned some of these already in a way, but there are things called global commons where no particular country has control over an area, the high seas, outer space, and Antarctica that is governed by a consortium of countries. Managing transboundary or shared resources. So we think here sort of river basins and aquifers that sort of don't respect national boundaries. So the Nile, for example, flows through, I don't know how many countries, starting in Uganda and flowing right to the Mediterranean Sea. But there are many, many transboundary aquifers in Africa also. Forests, biodiversity, we think of migrating sort of animals passing national boundaries. We need science diplomacy to build partnerships on international treaties like climate change, the Montreal Protocol for reducing the ozone hole, for example. The shared infrastructures like the synchrotron at Sesame that I mentioned, also CERN in Europe. And also to build, as I said, international relations when political tensions are high, science can be used as a sort of a bridge. There's a problem though. This was a paper published back in 1973 by Rittel and Weber. It has 3,200 citations. I think we'd all be proud of something like this. It says, the search for scientific basis for confronting problems of social policy, which is what the diplomats are essentially trying to do, is bound to fail because of the nature of these problems. They are wicked problems, whereas science has developed to deal with tame problems. So what do they mean by wicked and tame? So let me use the example of water. So we have simple or tame problems that science is very, very good at dealing with. Archimedes, way back 2,000 years ago, wanted to irrigate his land using water from the River Nile. He developed a system for raising water up. This is simple science, technological adaptations. We can move water from one place to another, and we can use that water. With advances in science and technology, science can deal with complicated systems. You can imagine a city like Accra or any other in the world. I had wonderful hot water in my shower this morning. I guess everybody else did. There's a reservoir somewhere that stores that water. It's piped it in. There's pumps, there's valves, there's controls so that everybody gets a fair share of water. These are complicated, but we can deal with that. And then there are so-called complex systems. Now we're looking at the watershed. Maybe there's an international border between the river here that passes, but we've got industries here that want their share of the water. We've got the people living here. We've got agriculture. We've maybe got fishermen wanting clean water to take fish to sell for their own livelihood. We've got the farmers. So it becomes a much more complex situation. And this is what the authors of that previous paper were referring to as a wicked problem. There's a lot of negotiations and discussions going on. The science can tell us how much rainfall there is, what the flow of the river is, but it can't decide for us how that water is shared amongst the different actors. And similar problems, I just mentioned the water, things like climate change, pollution, sustainable use of biodiversity, such as fisheries, communicable diseases, GMOs, energy, and so on. All these are wicked problems that science can provide the foundational knowledge, the input for that, but it can't really decide what the politicians, the diplomats need to decide on sort of resource sharing and so on. And similarly with the SDGs, they were mentioned by Stanley. We have here life in water, life on the land, and climate action, smart cities and responsible consumption, zero poverty, food security. All these things are wicked problems that we need science to address, but not science on its own is not enough. So I said the sort of modern definition of science diplomacy goes back just 10 years, but the actual practice is much older. And there are people who will present even sort of examples from the era of the Roman Empire and so on. But I'm just going to start with pointing out that the United Kingdom in 1723, the Royal Society appointed a foreign secretary for the Royal Society, whose job it was to go to France, Germany, Holland, and so on, and interact with the scientists there and bring back the scientific knowledge. And that person, the Foreign Secretary of the Royal Society, was in place 59 years before the British government even appointed a Secretary of State or a Minister for Foreign Affairs. So you can see that sort of the Royal Society was ahead of the British government at the time. Coming into more of the modern era, one sort of success of science diplomacy, if you like. This is from the book by Norman Norreiter, who was the science advisor to the US Secretary of State at one point in time. You see here the picture of Chairman Mao welcoming President Nixon to China in 1972. And they were able to do the sort of first deal, the opening up of China. And as Norreiter points out, the diplomatic history of Nixon's visit to China is well known. What is not well known is the way that science, the role that science may have played. So really, this was the first sort of from this meeting, the first exchanges of scientists and scientific collaboration between the US and China was established at this meeting, and it started a sort of rapprochement of relationships, and so we're able to build bigger and bigger projects as time moved forward. We started a science diplomacy training workshops in Trieste. We were fortunate to get Norman Norreiter himself here. I like this picture because on his right here, many of you might recognize him. He's been involved in the Cuban Academy of Sciences for many years, Sergio Pastrana. So we're standing shoulder to shoulder, Cuba and the USA. This chap here was part of a small delegation we had from North Korea. So you see a little bit of distance between the shoulders. It's perhaps widened there. So through science diplomacy, we can bring together the USA, Cuba, and North Korea, others from Brazil, and so on here. So we have this possibility to build those personal relations that can perhaps lead to other things through science, which is a safe topic that everybody understands at the same sort of level of scientific understanding. Okay, so since 2009-10, when this sort of science diplomacy boom started happening, a lot of the work and the examples have been very US-based, European-based. But I would like to argue here that there is a South-South aspect to science diplomacy that has been happening over the years and continues to grow. So I said in 2011, we started our program in partnership with AAAS. It now focuses on one training event a year in Trieste and a second event that is rotating around our trans-regional offices or our regional partners. So last year we came to Johannesburg, so we partnered with Stanley and had a good meeting in Pretoria. Earlier this year we were in Alexandria in Egypt with our Arab regional partner. At the Library of Alexandria. Next year we will go to Malaysia for the Asia region and so on and so on. So always trying to bring diplomats and in this case young scientists together to sort of build those relations, develop an understanding of science diplomacy in the scientific community and what young scientists can do in science diplomacy to develop their careers. But Africa itself has challenges. You probably don't need me to tell you some of these things. The number of PhDs, the size of the sort of science population, the number of active scientists in Africa is much lower than many other countries, especially the most developed ones. The publication output is also relatively low compared to the rest of the world. 2.4% of global research publications are from Africa. And if you look at this in a sort of visual way, you see the area of the country, it reflects the scientific output. You see Africa is quite shrunken. South Africa and Egypt are doing quite well. The other countries are much below the average. Even countries like New Zealand that I'll come to in a few minutes have a very strong scientific output. Okay, so here's Sir Peter Gluckman. He's now the incoming president of ISC, the International Science Council. President of the INGSA. I think INGSA were on one of the partners here on this particular meeting. And he was the former science advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand. And he says, as a small nation, New Zealand, we must compete hard to maintain our relevance in a world where we can easily be forgotten. We have to demonstrate that small countries can indeed make a difference. So how can we do this? How can small countries perhaps without strong scientific infrastructures, scientific capacity, make a difference. And one way is to start integrating the scientific community into that arena of science advice that the science academies are doing right now and that they should be doing in their own countries, but also reaching beyond that, as Stanley mentioned, to look at the sort of international environment, the international agreements where science needs to be present, where science advice is needed on a national level in order to inform those national delegations that proceed to the international negotiations. And there's some examples here. This is, for example, Panama has now got its own science diplomacy policy within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the government of Pakistan has also set up a science diplomacy initiative earlier this year. So there are examples from low and middle income countries coming through, recognizing the value of science diplomacy and integrating that not in the Ministry of Science or whatever, but in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So just to maybe confuse the issue as well, Peter Gluckman here was one of the authors of this other paper that put forward a new definition of science diplomacy. So it still works in parallel with the three pillars, but it defines it as actions designed to directly advance a country's national needs. So this is, representing your country in the international arena. Actions designed to address cross-border interests or sort of bilateral relations with your neighbors, perhaps. And then designed to meet global needs and challenges, such as the climate change agreement and so on. So sort of building up different levels of needs through science diplomacy. But I think it's not conflicting with our three pillars definition, but it's more sort of overlaid on top of it, if you like. So just to remind you of the three pillars: science in diplomacy, diplomacy for science, science for diplomacy. I'm going to give you now some examples of each of these, so maybe becomes sort of more clear what I'm trying to say here. So first of all, science in diplomacy. You see here, this chart is the number of international environmental treaties since around the end of the Second World War are really sort of taking off. We have the high seas, Antarctica, outer space, deep sea, and so on and so on. So these are international agreements. They are signed up to by all the member states of the United Nations. Once they are agreed at that level, they're brought back into the national governments for ratification, and so on and so on. So if your scientific community is not present in the discussions sort of that set out what is required of countries in these different negotiations, then you're obviously going to miss out when it comes to ratifying it and sort of acting upon your obligations at that point. So you can have perhaps obligations that you might not agree with because you weren't strong enough at the discussion table. And here's just some 2015, some of the international agreements: the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, of course, and the SDGs, all signed in 2015. So nearly every country in the world, I think, has signed up to all of these, although, of course, one major country is now removing itself from the Paris Climate Agreement. And just to highlight, the Paris Climate Agreement, it has been ratified. It became legally into force by 2016. And we'll look at some of the outputs after lunch. We'll have another exercise in science diplomacy. We'll talk more about this latest report from the IPCC. It was released a year ago about limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So these are an example of science in diplomacy. Scientists are providing the knowledge, the input into these reports of the IPCC that are then read and acted on by the governments and taken into account in the international negotiations. Here's the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. You see just also one example of one of the clauses. It very much focuses on scientific research and scientific and technical input. So science and technology is really at the center of the script, the text of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Moving to science for diplomacy, so this is where countries can use science in their diplomatic efforts. There's an example from India and the Prime Minister of India speaking at the Science Congress that they hold every year. He said India has a lot of strong links with many countries around the world, and he has decided to place science and technology at the forefront of our diplomatic engagement. So he wants to use those scientific collaborations to build additional bridges for diplomatic purposes. So we've also offered our expertise to our neighbors and other developing countries. So this is very much a reciprocal arrangement that Prime Minister Modi was offering at this point. And we actually now have, between GAAS and the Department of Science and Technology of India, an ongoing program again for training workshops in science diplomacy for not only Indian scientists, but young scientists from the South and Southeast Asia region. Still science for diplomacy, we could call it a subset, health diplomacy. Cuba is very strong in medicine. It sends out many health workers, more than 50,000 in 66 countries over the last, I don't know how many years. But when the Ebola epidemic was raging in West Africa, in Sierra Leone and Liberia and so on, Cuba announced very quickly that it would send 165 experts to the frontline response efforts, and at the time it was the largest offer of any medical team from a single country. So Cuba really sort of led the way, and perhaps even gave incentives to other larger, richer countries to really get engaged in the Ebola epidemic that, of course, really required international collaboration. The World Health Organization was involved to bring that under control. Here's one, you may remember the fire in the Brazilian museum. So they lost a lot of artifacts, a lot of scientific heritage from the country was lost just a year ago, in September 2018. And here's a sort of helping hand from China. So the Chinese paleontologists, the letter here, you can't read it very well, but it's essentially a letter from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the Chinese government agency, reaching out to its members, member institutions, its museums in China, say, what fossils, what other examples do you have? What sort of scientific treasures you have that aren't on display in China? We have so many of them that we can give to Brazil as a gesture of goodwill, if you like, and of course, for Brazil to be able to rebuild its collection in this fire-devastated museum. So again, this was something that didn't need to be done, but it was a reaching across from China to Brazil, very much south-south, a gesture of solidarity with the sort of across the BRICS countries, if you like. Okay. Then we come to diplomacy for science. So this is where the nation states themselves are investing in science, but in science as a method of countries working together. So you may be familiar with the Eco Science Foundation. It's hosted in Pakistan. I think Sudan is a member, amongst others. Again, it was established in 2011. Sorry, Sudan is not a member of this one. It's largely the Pakistan, Kazakhstan, and some of those countries in Central Asia. But really the idea is to get those countries working together on common scientific issues that will lead to economic development of the 10 member countries. An example from Africa, Diplomacy for Science, is the Nelson Mandela African Institute for Science and Technology. So this is for trying to build the next generation of scientists and engineers. So it's a central campus for students from the whole of Africa to work and learn and research. And here's one with Brazil and Africa. It goes back to the Lula presidency of Brazil. But he established 19 new embassies across Africa, bringing a total to 37 in 54 African countries. So it put Brazil among non-African countries as the fifth largest number of embassies in Africa, after the US, China, France, and Russia. So Brazil ahead of the UK, for example. And really the focus of those embassies was on exchanges in areas like agriculture, health, energy, technology transfer, and so on. Of course, some of these examples I'm giving, like the US drawing out of the Paris Climate Agreement and a change of presidency in Brazil, which has maybe affected some of the relations or the emphasis of Brazil on some maintaining some of these relations. It shows how what's the right word? It's not solid foundations necessarily of science diplomacy, but it can also depend on personal actors. And then also a classic example that we use diplomacy for science in the Africa continent especially is the square kilometer array. I'm sure it's hosted in South Africa. It's currently being built. I think there is an operational part also in Ghana. And you see the member countries here. These have all come together. They've agreed on sort of common funding mechanisms, common administrative operational mechanisms between also the UK and Australia and so on. And this is a really big infrastructure, a telescope that will cover in different pieces 1 square kilometer, that will really start to help us explore the outer areas of the universe, but also build capacity in sort of data management and so on, which is one particular reason why South Africa was very keen to get involved. Okay. And then sort of other examples from the Africa region. Again, going back to the Ebola outbreak, Uganda had dealt with outbreaks before in its own nation, so it was able to offer sort of on-the-ground assistance, if you like, to the West African countries that required it. And here's an example of within country, but with different communities involved. Going back to 2016, when polio was coming back in Nigeria, and here it was the traditional and religious leaders that were convinced by the scientific evidence of the value of the vaccination campaign, and the health workers reached out to the religious leaders, and the religious leaders were then able to convince the population to get the children vaccinated and so on. So this is, as I say, a within country rather than international relations, but you see the differences. In this case, the religious community rather than the diplomatic community. They don't have a lot in common with the scientists and the scientific way of thinking, but there are ways to bridge that through discussion and dialogue that can have successful results. And here's the Sesame, the synchrotron that's been built in Jordan. I like to talk about this as a two-part operation, if you like, starting with science for diplomacy. So if you're not familiar with the story, there was a synchrotron in Germany that was being decommissioned because there were sort of newer, more modern versions available that Germany wanted to build. And the idea, rather than throwing it away, was to offer it to somewhere where it would be useful, where there wasn't that sort of technology and operational apparatus for the local scientists. So eventually, this consortium of countries, you see quite a diverse, with Iran, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, and so on, coming together. It's now been built in Jordan. So as an initiative that came from the scientific community, it is now operating as a mechanism of the diplomatic community of these countries to bring the scientists together to again maintain those bridges when relations between some of these countries are again not particularly strong, not particularly friendly. So it's been a process of moving from one of the pillars of science diplomacy to another pillar. Okay, so why is science diplomacy relevant, and what we need to ensure to have effective science diplomacy? We need the capacity within our national borders, our national science systems. Just to point out in this paper in Nature Climate Change, around 80% of authors and reviewers of successive assessment reports produced by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change were from OECD countries. This means the voices of the authors and the voices of those other non-OECD countries, which is the majority of those in the world, are not being heard in those IPCC reports that are the basis of the international negotiations. So you see the circle here. So you see the mismatch, scientists from the north versus those from the south, feeding into the IPCC reports, which has led to the Paris Climate Change Agreement, for example, and now being ratified and into international policies, international laws. But the influence, is really coming from the scientists in the OECD countries. So hence, the need for more scientific capacity and greater links, even national levels, between scientists and their national governments in the developing countries. And just as an example here, that 1.5 degree report that came out last year I mentioned, again, you probably can't see the text here, but this is the number of authors, 91 in all. So I counted yesterday the first 10, so about 10% of the authorship are from Africa. And there was actually, I counted 10 other tiny countries, maybe I can read them, someone like Fiji and Jamaica and so on, had as much input into this report as the whole of the African continent. So you can see there is an imbalance and a real need for African input into these global reports. And this is, I think, where the science academies and other scientific associations can really start to play a part to feed that information into their national science systems and into the UN and international systems. And it's all about building relations, I think, and developing those diplomatic relations, that credibility of offering scientific advice that is peer-reviewed, that is independent, and so on, that the academies really can play a key role in doing. Again, this is a chart from a paper from 2016. And you see there are different sources of scientific advice here. The second from the bottom is a National Academy of Science. And you see it is largely green and yellow, which, according to the authors of this paper, is either medium or largely high likelihood of science advice being accepted by governments. So there is an understanding that academies do play this role, they have this role to play. In fact, the only one that is better than the National Academy is a independent chief science advisor. But that's very different from perhaps an individual scientist advocate that it scores quite low on some of the trustworthiness and so on, because you never know which agenda might be being pushed. So I've mentioned before, a lot of this feeds into the UN organizations, whether it's UNESCO, the World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture organizations, and so on. A lot of international agreements, international organizations require continued input of science advice, and not just from OECD countries, but from around the world, and they are making efforts to diversify their sources of information. For example, we have a relationship as IAP with the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So often you, as academies, would receive from us calls for expertise to feed into their different panels, the different working groups that they are establishing. So this is an opportunity also for academies to find from among their membership, the ideal persons to feed into these working groups that can start affecting the international documentations. And here's others: conventions on biological diversity, biological toxin weapons convention, chemical weapons convention, all requiring scientific input in order to maintain their effectiveness. I just wanted to, I think, more or less finish. Have I still got time? On the UN Convention from the Law of the Sea, which you saw earlier, was one of the earliest international environmental conventions. It governs the exploitation of minerals in what we call areas beyond national jurisdictions. So, you know, maritime nations have a certain distance from their shorelines where they have jurisdiction, and beyond that is the ungoverned space. But there is this UN convention that lays out about any minerals extracted from those areas. The benefits are shared with all the signatories of the convention. But it applies to minerals also. So when it comes to marine genetic resources, and you know there are a lot of deep water vents with unusual bacteria and other unusual animals down there that are now being harvested, and looked for particular enzymes and so on that could be useful in future biotech applications. So, and there are now thousands of patents on these that are marine genetic resources that are beyond the control of nation states. And you see that 98% of all patented sequences are either in 10 countries, 165 countries are not represented, but perhaps more surprisingly, one private company, BASF in Germany, and a lot of other companies hold, what's that, 84% of those patents on marine organisms. So you see, universities hold 12% and other organizations hold 4%. So this is where the nation states are. Of those, they are largely countries like the US, Japan, China, and European countries, and the rest are held by private companies. So there are discussions now in the Convention of Biological Diversity or in the Law of the Sea to extend this idea of mineral exploitation and sharing the benefits to also the biological organisms in the deep sea. The problem is, and you see here sort of highlighted, the lack of participation and continuity among delegations of developing countries hampers equitable engagement by these states. These states need to increase their commitments to capacity building, including scientific training and collaboration, again, in order to have a real voice at the table on these international discussions to get the benefits that are there, that are available, if you know how to negotiate for them. In the case of water, we've talked about transboundary rivers and aquifers and so on. So from a book on water diplomacy, going back to the Millennium Development Goals, it was agreed that Africa would need an estimated 300% increase in the number of trained water professionals just to reach the Millennium Development Goals. The other developing areas, 200%, 50%, or again, needing a lot of additional scientific capacity just to get a handle on the Millennium Development Goals, and of course water is part of the Sustainable Development Goals too. So just another example of the requirements of Zambia requesting international assistance in order to build up its capacity in this area. So just to summarize then, the needs of the Global South, more and better science. So this is also a two-way street here. So the governments, I think, in many African countries have committed to 1% of their GDP to be invested in their national research and development agendas, but many countries are not at that level yet. But there needs to be that investment in order to develop the capacity in the country. The scientific community on its part needs to engage with the policymakers and the diplomatic community, not necessarily going with the begging bowl asking for that money, but really to offer what it can do in the role of science advice and science diplomacy that is of interest to the government, to make a case, and so the government see the need for that science feeding through its own systems. And sort of then you start to build up these communications and the recognition of the science, of the policymakers and the diplomatic communities for the benefits of what the scientific community can offer. So GAAS that we started mentioning and other organizations have put a lot of effort into PhD training, human capital mobility, supporting research projects and so on. But we would add that science diplomacy is a critical ingredient for building scientific capacity and excellence in the South for sustainable development, attaining the Sustainable Development Goals, and so on. I think basically this is just a summary of what I've been saying. We have a globally increasing population. I think they call it the youth bulge in Africa. Africa is one of the fastest growing areas of the world, sort of population-wise. The SDGs do tell us to leave nobody behind, so everybody is important. We have wicked problems, the SDGs themselves, and many of these problems, these wicked problems, are more acute in the developing countries, such as many African nations where science and technology capacity is less developed. Science diplomacy, it's an old practice, a new label, but it's increasingly being recognized and practiced to address national and global challenges. And countries in the South need to develop their scientific expertise, not only for research, but also to engage nationally, I would say, and globally, in order to have that influence for the benefit of their countries. So I think let me stop there. Thank you. Time?
I'll call you later, Peter.
Okay, sure.
I'll call you later for questions. Hold those questions a bit. I'm asking these three people to come and take the seats in front. Professor Himla Sudial from ASAF, I've already introduced here as my boss. Dr. Doyin Odibanjo from the Nigerian Academy of Science. And last but not the least, Mrs. Cheki Olankado from NASAC. The bios of these three colleagues here, two ladies and one gentleman, are in the Green Book. I cannot read them because reading one of them would spend the whole day here. They are so long because of their experience in science diplomacy through the work they do, the organizations they work for, and their individual capacities as leaders within the African continent in the science space speak so much about what academies, as individual country academies, but also as a network, can do for science diplomacy. So in their order, I'll give them to speak. I'm not sure whether they have PowerPoint, but there's a mic here. Speak for some few minutes. Sir, can you help me? I'm not, speak for a few minutes and then we'll then open a discussion around questions and answers. Yes, you start from here, going that side. Thank you.
Well, good day, everyone, and thank you, Stanley, for that introduction, and to Peter for the presentation that sets the stage for discussion. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are all here representing some entity. Irrespective of what entity you represent, you're already wearing multiple caps. First, you're probably niched as a researcher within a university or some organization. Then you may be representing your academy or some region. And so whether you like it or not, you're a diplomat. So what you heard from Peter was basically trying to contextualize what it is that you do in terms of what we all as a collective should be doing. And that is first and foremost being advocates for science, not just science as a generic, but evidence-based science. Because that at the end of the day is the power, the knowledge economy that we bring to, as a collective to share with fellow colleagues, with professionals across the discipline that we may be coming from, at national levels with our policymakers, civil society, and other stakeholders, at the international level, as Peter has pointed out to us. So basically, if you didn't realize it, you're already a seasoned diplomat and you need to be certified. So just remember that. Now, I want to just get out of the science mode for a while. Some of you may know that about 2 weeks ago, South Africa won the Rugby World Cup. Yay! Right? What's happened is the country is now in a state of euphoria. Something you would not have imagined. So my question is, why is it that sports can bring that can raise that kind of emotion, that kind of synergy, that kind of support, representing the nation? What is it that we do wrong? Or why is it that science, which is the knowledge economy of the country, is never really recognized? How do we move that energy from the sport front into the science front? So there's a lot of questions there. And Peter did touch on some of that, and that the issue is of trust, trustworthiness, the way in which we represent our particular portfolios, etc. Now, from a South African perspective, despite all the challenges that we currently experience, the last couple of days have just been euphoric. To start off, I was on a plane when the game was on, going to the BRICS academies in Brazil, so I missed all the live action and caught snippets of it first when the game was over by the pilots. Of course, the entire plane with most of the South African people on board, you know, threw their arms up and screamed and clapped. And of course, I also shared a little gin and tonic to celebrate. And then we see the country going the way it is, with all this excitement of the drawing and bringing the people together. And I constantly ask myself, why? Is sport so powerful that it can do that? Or is it because the captain represents the majority of the populace, and so it's not just a win of sport, but a win for the people at large, representing the demographic profile of the country. It's quite an amazing experience, an example to take at heart in terms of the lessons we as members of the scientific cohort can grapple with to see to what extent we can popularize science. Now that's one example. Then let's take the Pop Idols music contest. Again, music can bring the entire countries to the board to vote for their most favorite idol. How many people within your academies vote for the new members? In our academy, we range between 12 and 20%. Even among the academies, we don't have the buy-in. So what kind of diplomacy can we bring into our own academies for the recognition of what academies are? These are all integrated questions. We have lots of successes out of the science sector, and how can we bring that in? So we have a few other types of science contests, etc., but they never ever gain the momentum as we do with the sport and the music. So we have some lessons to learn from there. But while I distract from the issue at hand, I guess what I'm looking for is, what is it that we are missing in terms of gaining momentum, gaining the gravitas to put science on the agenda for our national governments? As my colleague Stanley mentioned, we talk about the SDGs, etc., but we should start at the national level of supporting our national plans. So how do we do it in a way that collectively builds momentum so that as countries, we are much, much more effective as using science and evidence-based science to address local problems? From unemployment to poverty to climate change, all the topics we will engage with in the next 2 days or next 3 days while we are here at the meeting is driven by the core perception of the way in which we value science. This morning's display at the opening ceremony was another example of science diplomacy. This country had, even if it was for a short moment, the presence of the president, the minister, to honor this function in giving support to the Ghanaian Academy for what you are celebrating. Firstly, congratulations on your 60 years. But again, it is the kind of support you want from your government, and for you to have that sense of pride that whatever you do, you're representing your government and the people of the country. So the morning was another classic example of science diplomacy in the way in which the science is integrated into the fiber of society, from the political goodwill, and I'm sure the messages will be conveyed on the television from all the press attention that the morning received. So in closing, all I want to say is that yes, we all do science diplomacy, whether we know it or not, because we represent that voice of bringing the collective of the many caps that we wear when we are present at functions like these and others. And I don't know what the answers are, but maybe at some point we can have those sorts of discussions on how we make science sexier to the public at large, so that we get a better soundbite of their buy-in from what we do. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you to Peter and Im actually for those comments already. I think they've covered the angles pretty well. Coming to Ghana this time around, this is probably my third or fourth time. But this time around, perhaps for the first time, I had a bit of concern. You know, I thought I might be asked a few unpleasant questions at the border because Nigeria has closed its borders, land borders, for some weeks now. And so that's not a pleasant thing. We are not favorites of our neighbors in recent times. Professor Nkono is nodding, and I know the last report I read was Ghanaian traders actually trying to shut down shops of Nigerian traders here. So on coming, I kept thinking, okay, well, the least that will happen is that somebody is going to ask me, what are you doing here? Which normally doesn't happen. You carry a Nigerian passport, you walk through, but pleasantly nobody did ask that question. So the real issue is that where perhaps, thank you. So perhaps as if I was a trader, maybe I would be asked the question. But maybe as a scientist, we get freer interactions, we get freer reasons to interact like we are here today. So the aim and where IMLA ended is where I'm starting, which is to say that we have access that others may not have, and where even there is friction among countries, scientists actually can break through some of those frictions to collaborate and talk. I was trying to scan and count how many countries I could find in this room, and they probably run above 15, maybe even 20 countries at the very least in this room. And that means in the next 2-3 days, we have a golden opportunity to practice science diplomacy, to foster collaboration among our different countries. And the key to that is our ability to build trust, among ourselves. The key to that is the ability to cut through all the facade and all the personalities and build some kind of relationships of trust among ourselves. And like she said also earlier, that in country, every scientist now, more than ever, actually needs to develop certain capacities. Maybe rounding it up, you'll call it the science advice capacity, which is the ability to influence policy. I know that I would speak to many scientists, and they're very reluctant, very reluctant to engage with government, very reluctant to deal with anything government. No, those people are just different. We don't want to talk to them. However, if we're talking about development, especially in the continent, there's no way that any scientist now can sit in his research lab or institute and all that and continue to work without looking for how to influence what policies are being made and how policies are being made. So as scientists, we all have to be diplomats. We all have to find the skills. And one of the things I want to pick from, particularly what Peter was saying, was the fact that this is an art. Perhaps more than a science. This is an art. This is something that you have to kind of build that capacity of what's the language to use. How do you approach these things? How, if you had just a few minutes to explain these great terminologies and the importance of these fantastic things you've been working on for 3 years, how do you say that in 5 minutes and convince the policymaker that this is important enough? Somebody was speaking at the recent meeting where I was, and he said, it's very difficult to talk about things like climate change to our policymakers in that country. He said it's very difficult because they look at it and say, look, we have more serious problems that are staring us in the face. You're talking about something I can't see and with implications that are still coming. I have many more major things to deal with now. So how do you make that same thing something that he would say to you in 2-3 minutes? Okay, you know what, I don't have time right now, but I think that what you are saying is really important and we need to sit down and talk about this more. How do we get in their scheme of things and get on their priority list? And that's what everyone has to do. That's the job that everyone has to do. And it means that it begins with science advice. I'm trying to tie it together. It begins with the science advice capacities that we develop even in country, that also ensures that we can now be ambassadors that can help to aid diplomacy even among countries. I also chair the INSA chapter, that's the International Network for Government Science Advice in Africa. And one of the things that INSA has had to do in recent times is to set up a division for foreign ministers in science and technology advisory network, which is called FM STAN. And that group basically consists of advisors within foreign ministries, science advisors within foreign ministries, because it is now noted that it is very important for you to achieve your foreign, what do you call them, foreign policy objectives. Science would be a major tool to achieve those things. So countries that are hardly talking, I was remembering even the USSR and the US, the former Soviet Union and the US, and how despite the issues, they could send astronauts to the moon together. You know, that's how powerful this is. The fact that you can still walk underneath. Many times also, I was thinking about many times scientists have been accused of being spies. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they are not. They are just actually people who facilitate communication where there was none. And so they arouse some suspicion sometimes. Well, I'm not hoping anybody gets arrested. But the point is that the fact that they can actually have access, and sometimes actually countries and governments have had to turn to those same scientists to say, we have no relationship, but you do. So we need you to help us talk, you know, about and create channels of communication. So I think it's critical that we all look at that. And looking at challenges, there are a few challenges. I wouldn't want to go too much into them, like language, like you know, financial resources. But I think that we have, especially in this day and age, many opportunities to get by many of these things. I'd like to stop for now on the note that I think Amasa itself, the Amasa meeting itself, is a major opportunity, you know, for science advice on this continent, you know, the annual meeting of African Science Academies. I think it's already achieving that, but the more we flag that, the better we can make use of it, you know, to achieve that purpose. And that's why I like to say that, well, this is not about a speech or a lecture on science diplomacy. The learning collaboratives actually are more about us discussing together. These are just talks to highlight a few things, and then we can discuss them more soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm actually honored to be able to add my voice to what we've just had this afternoon, this morning? Afternoon now. Okay, so I think I'll try and focus my intervention on what can academies do. And this is based on the fact that you've heard what science diplomacy is, based on Peter's presentation. You've heard how we need to make science a bit relevant, if not sexy, according to Himmler. But then also the question that
is how do we go about doing that? So my intervention is focused on two things. One is if we as science academies realize that actually science diplomacy is important, then I think it has to be documented. Documented in that we need to develop a template of what science diplomacy means for us in context. So one thing that I think has worked or would work in academies that are taking science diplomacy seriously is the mention of science diplomacy itself in its own strategic documents. If, for instance, an academy had a plan or a working document around science diplomacy, then the focus around giving science archives will actually come to the fore. It means that that academy will go beyond its own science to do more with government and more with society. It also means that the disciplinary silos that we see among scientists will be transcended. But documenting that and expressing that vision is the first way of ensuring that academies do focus their attention towards not just science diplomacy itself, but also building relationships that we plan. So my first point is to be able to document that strategy. The challenge with this is the question, and I think Johnny put it clearly, is who will be responsible for documenting that? Who will we task to be able to do both science and diplomacy in the same manner and in the same balancing act that we build the fruits that the academies want to deliver after developing science strategy? So that was my first point. The second point then is after developing a good document, and then the mention of what science diplomacy means for the academy is who would be the sees as science diplomacy. This can come in the form of setting up an office. So if you did set up an office, whether we would determine to call it the foreign secretary, as some of our countries have done, or you call that office the Secretary General's office, or you create a staff position that will be responsible for that, like as they have the liaison officer to be responsible for science diplomacy activity. But that office is critical because then it means you have somebody who is responsible to drive the academic's agenda in fulfilling that mandate. I think that part of office or staff would be articulated in the document that we developed in the first place. But then I move into what would be the challenge of that is predetermining what qualifications we are looking for in this office or in this person to be able to deliver. And the last point that I want to highlight in terms of science diplomacy is we need to articulate what relevant activities would be termed as science diplomacy activities. This is because from what we've had, the academies do not work in isolation. They need to interact with other academies like themselves. They need to be able to speak to governments, their own national governments, within and within their sub-region, but not only that, to be able to articulate science issues that are global in nature. If we're talking about Africa specifically, the African Union's Agenda 2063 comes to mind, or the UN Agenda for Sustainable Development of 2030 comes also to mind. But then the academy would have to align this activity to fulfill this global, national, or regional aspirations for the continent. So, for instance, I know for the UN Sustainable Development Goals, different countries do voluntary, voluntary national reviews. So they're able to articulate where have we reached in terms of fulfilling the development agenda that they signed up. So specific agenda 2030. Now the academies should be able to be part of that process. The diplomacy angle means that you as academicians are able to articulate what science is necessary to drive development, to drive cooperation, but also to build relationships in the continent, within the country, but also globally. I think I want to stop there because my 3 items are 1, develop a strategy, 2, task a person responsible for it, but 3 is to generate activities that will be relevant to science and diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the panel speakers. Can I allow Peter to come so that I balance this strategy? Can I also have a mic, a rolling mic, go around so that we give time for comments, for questions, for inputs before we get close for lunch? So you indicate by lifting up your hand and I recognize you, and then you talk. You don't talk before I recognize you. Where is the mic? Okay, I see one hand. Any other hand? Okay.
Thank you, Stanley. I'm Suad Suleiman from the Sudanese National Academy of Sciences, and we as science academies, we see a lot of material transfer from one country to the other in projects, joint projects, and in trade, in export. How can we legalize those movements and really put a control so that those natural products or material are identified to the country? I know there is an agreement, but Peter did not mention it.
Peter?
Okay, so, well, I'm not an expert in material transfers or import-export, but what I can say is that under sort of international laws like the Convention for Biological Diversity, countries do have the right to benefit from their indigenous biodiversity. And a lot of countries have put very strong material transfer arrangements in place. I remember a long way back when I was an active scientist, trying to get samples of sort of infected leaf material out of India and places like this was very, very difficult because of these regulations. They didn't like to release what they understood to be their, national property, if you like, to laboratories outside the country, and I would imagine, I understand it's become even more difficult over the years. So that it's just a question of different countries implementing those regulations that they're entitled to do. It can make it difficult for scientists working, but it is presumably of benefit to the country in order to get the feedback and the benefits from the results that would come from that research down the line. If you let the samples go without that, then you run the risks of losing some of that. So again, it's a question of capacity building and implementation, understanding what the international regulations are.
Yes, thank you. So, for example, with the use of biological material, especially when it concerns human subjects, most universities have in place review boards, the ethics committees, that would first review the request based on the scientists in question locally, with what it is they wish to collaborate and what the nature of the exchange is. When it concerns sending samples abroad, for example, in our country, we've established a material transfer agreement that has to be processed and endorsed by the university's ethics committee, and the recipient country that will receive the samples will have to also sign certain agreements. When it concerns samples of heritage that are older and artifactual, in our country we have the Heritage Act that protects, and that has to go through those processes. So usually the ethics boards and review committees within universities tries to have an input into how those processes happen. Having said that, no matter how good your processes are, we have had experiences of this parachute science happening where people come in, take samples, go away, and no processes have been followed, and this is what brings disrepute into the science.
Okay, some more questions. I saw one, another 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. We'll take the 3 and then go to the answers.
Thank you very much. I'm Robin Crew from ASAP. I wanted to ask the panel whether they could reflect for a moment on the fact that scientific activities are inherently international. And that scientists develop a network of international connections as a result of the work they do in their discipline. And I think that Peter's example of the Royal Society is a very good one, because the Royal Society was developing an international connection of scientists who were working on a range of different subjects. And interestingly, the Royal Society never expelled any members, even though those members might come from countries which were fighting with the United Kingdom at the time, because they regarded their presence in the academy as a recognition for their activities as scientists. So my question is as follows. What you are talking about in relation to science diplomacy is a national approach, and serving a national interest, whereas the scientists now have a dual role, which is one, they're connected to this international network, and secondly, you're expecting them to act in the national interest. And for obvious reasons, you can see such situations in which conflict might arise. And so I wanted you to give a comment on how you think the scientists should handle that kind of conflict. And I'll just finish off by making one point. When you did and Mr. President, the impact on science and science diplomacy, it can be very significant, as we've seen in the recent past. Thank you.
Okay, I recognize Professor from Zambia. I'll give you Professor Abdul for, and then you come to the
Thank you. My name is Abonda. My question is directed to Jackie. You talked about academies creating an office, specifically dedicated to science and diplomacy, to effectively drive the science agenda. That's only how governments, don't you think that it would be more effective for African governments as well to create an office dedicated to driving the science agenda? For example, it would be maybe the chief advisor to the president or something of sort. Thank you.
Prof, in fact, I missed the name, but I recognize it.
Thank you. I did not really hear from here the work being done by submitting a set of innovations. For example, there is FARA. FARA is Forum for Africa Research in Africa. Now, Forum has been well developed by the soft organizations in Africa, in West and Central Africa. Our soft organization is called Forum or Web. Now, if you go to East Africa, they have ASEREC. If you go to South Africa, they have SADC. Now, these soft organizations, because of the difficulty we get into the politicians, we are now together to form FARA, which is based in Accra. Now, these sovereign organizations are doing a lot of research in the sense that they are organizations who are source of funds, because actually funding is a big problem in Africa. To support the research being carried out by sovereign organizations. And so if, for example, FARA is seeing governments are giving support to these organizations. Now, how do you expect the countries to go to the government to tell them everything that they are doing, maybe canceling our agriculture because I'm agriculturist? It will seem to be a complication. Alright. So what language, what other technique do we use when it comes to science and diplomacy? When we have some of these very active solving our continental applications doing about the same thing. Thank you.
The fourth question is we'll come back to you. Let's take a percent special coverage next time.
Good morning. I'm speaker, President from GAAS. I know that science diplomacy is a passion. It's very sexy to talk about science diplomacy. Saying that, we are giving to science a role that is not prepared for it. Science is the research of the truth, is to how to understand the nature, our environment, and how to impact it on the well-being of the society. Diplomacy is the role of politicians. Now, all the examples I have seen of presentation of paper, for me, it's not science diplomacy. It's just scientists, they met, and perhaps they take a bring together, and then they try to implement some collaboration, some partnership. So that's collaboration. As Robin said, it's in nature of scientists to make international networks, to work together beyond borders, what matter, whatever is this political situation. Now, if I want to use a scientist as a diplomat, then I am wearing another club, which is not science. I am trying to promote my country, I am trying to promote my region. For me, it's not yet clear. We can use the word science diplomacy, but all now in Australia, during last night, with the President of American Academy of Science, with South Korea, North Korea, and what just people who met, they discuss, they appreciate each other, and then they try to make some bridges between their countries, whatever is the political situation. Now, to bring science, to give it a role, diplomacy, meaning diplomacy, the true terminology of what does mean diplomacy. That's another role. I would like to have some comments from the insurance from the colleagues. You can elaborate on this.
Okay, shall we just start the research daily to JavaScript more study?
Okay, I'm just going to answer the question that Sarah asked is why we want to first government create an office called Chief Scientific Advisory State. And I think this is a discussion that we've had with ministers of science and technology. I think that in one activity that was organized by INSA in Rwanda, and that idea was structural. Simply because, one, it creates a superhuman infrastructure, and the political dynamics in government do not allow the existence of such capacity or this capacity to be able to thrive. It has worked elsewhere, in New Zealand, and it has also worked in the UK, and I think also the UN system in France. But within the African context, it was really shown up by the ministers present because it creates some political abuse. Secondly, is the fact that there is also within government a structure by which they get science funding. Whether we're talking about the ministries of science and technology, or we're talking about the Department of Science and Technology, or the National Science Technology Research Commissions, those structures exist. And it also was very clear that you can encourage, but it is not possible to effect. You can encourage the creation of this position, but addition is not possible to effect. And that is why I think in how we interpret those science needs for us as academics, then we are able to effect our role in government. And remember, I started by saying that if science advice is critical, so science academics, then there's need for this office. Essentially, is that the role of the academy is to try and influence policy and influence communities. So creating a space for the academics to influence policy is the task of the person who starts with that approach. So I think I just leave it at that.
So I think it also refers from that people. Chief Science I think that is not it's what it's on, which is here, but that's so that's kind of so that's what some of us American security, and especially I think on the continent, many countries and many people will fear such a position. not just the ministers, but even the scientists. And we are getting to the instances where the presidents were allocated to watch power. And also very important that I mean, the type of somebody to start about scientists in the country, meaning that in this markets, you have issues, so I think that's why there's quite some resistance on the continent about the aspects to, what are the qualities you want. And I think one of the biggest qualities you might be seeking for in anybody in this kind of space is humility. Someone who's that stable and approachable, and also knows his limits, knows that for one, he doesn't know everything, and he needs to be talking to others. Now, the advantage for attendance in that regard, and on the continent, is that people feel more relaxed. This is not about one person, this is an institution of distinguished experts who will advise. So we expect that there's some deliberation, there's some process, and it's not, nobody becomes the superhuman scientist, the go-to scientist of the country in that sense. So when you get it, you take a theory from an institution that consists of not just people that members of that academy, consists of all the experts possible around. Because the academies also have the power, the prevailing power to reach out to scientists in country and outside their country, to get whatever they need to get. So I think that's where the science advisor is basically many countries, like she said, really don't want to go there because they know that this could be something that's going to happen at all. With the scientists themselves, sometimes not countries. Talking about the role of putting on scientists, the role of being people at home, I think what's happening is that we're giving the name to something that should, or that is naturally happening, and that's always been happening. So we're trying to give the name, trying to turn it into a subject, trying to create a curriculum, trying to create test questions, and work on to something that rather happens naturally. It's like a soft skill, which is that basically it happens within the scientific work. It happens almost naturally. And that also raises the question of who exactly are the people that can play those roles. When Travis talks about creating an office again, sometimes you don't create an office, but you have a strategy, you have an operating strategy, you have something, and you have specific people, person or persons that you will fit the role. And there are particularly people you put on certain tasks and errands because you know that when they do this, foster relationships, great relationships where they go, able to get there, do science, but they come back with new collaboration, they come back with new relationships, they come back after they improve the image of your institution or company and all of that. And I think that's really important because if you also just take it and say, well, we have somebody. What I'm saying is that the qualities are more important than the others. So we're doing this because we will have a college secretary, we will have whatever science people will be, and those people could actually be disasters, actually working against what we really want to achieve. So I think it's more looking at it from the softer side than on the other side. So what is happening to us and why Professor Bosmila is worried about it is that we're getting into a force. And sometimes people talking about science advice, sometimes about raising questions in forums and things and all that, to say, is this something that everybody can do, or that we can train everybody to do, in that sense. Not exactly, some will be always be better than others because this is one thing, this is their constitution, that's their personality, absolutely. Outside today. So on GMO, and I was telling them, I said, the basic one, the basic that which came out from policy reform in Nigerian Academy of Science is that you to understand the power of the local resource, the local experts. So when there's a lot of controversy around that, people want to hear from their local experts. Sometimes there's distrust because it's coming from abroad. But if the local experts were to speak on this matter, the right local experts, it matters a lot. So if they are telling you where to issue a statement on that issue, it matters a lot because they are telling you to control or command the trust of their people.
About this concept of scientists, if you like, working in the science philosophy or even use of sexy, fashionable areas. There are some people actually talking at the world first. We don't really see that here, really shape. But there is really a conflict of the scientists maintaining an independence, collaborating with whoever they want to collaborate with, issuance of knowledge in their field, whether that person is in their own country or a global community, there is also a growing space and area that's showing the cartoon, the politician and the scientist, that gap in the middle needs to be filled. There are scientists in there working as those bridges. Many of us that asked me were very good day, we're attending our academies and so on. We're looking at in all states, but that's the case it is. Where first the conflict is sometimes where it's seen as governments potentially trying to impose that on the scientists. I think I'm trying to remember the Netherlands put out a call to its scientific community, fellowships in science and policy, which is pushed back these by the scientific community. So we are scientists, research, we are not political opponents. We don't want to play your political games. So there is a fine line where your personalities,
Very scientific people. And I'll give it an example. I happened a few years back, I happened to be the chairman of the Reform Commission of Ghana, which is responsible for the housekeeping regulation of the petroleum industry in the country. And we discovered some oil
the border between Ghana and Ivory Coast. Suddenly, Ivory Coast decided that the maritime border between Ghana and Ivory Coast that we have known since time immemorial should shift from Ghana to GAAS so that they will own that oil. So, the governments were handling this thing diplomatically, lawyers were going up and down. And we the development realized that we were about to lose that particular oil pipe. So we advised that Ghana has to go to Lagos. According to Lagos, that is international tribunal for law of the sea. Going to Lagos meant that you have to be able to prove that your border, maritime border, was exactly what you were doing, and not what the Ivory Coast was doing. And this required a lot of scientific work, geophysicists, geochemists, geomatic engineers, geographers, and all of scientific things to handle this issue. In fact, 80% or more of the work was done by the scientists. That's about 50% was done by the lawyers who became the big face of this whole issue. And when Ghana eventually won the case, none of the work that the scientists had done was even mentioned. People didn't even know that the work that led to Ghana winning that case in the day was by the scientists. The Attorney General got all the accolades. The Minister for whatever it is got all the volumes. And the scientists who were behind the solid work that was done were not even mentioned.
Thank you so much.
In fact, that's why I want to ask, how do we get the work of the scientists to be recognized so that it can raise a sort of euphoria that the lawyers and the other people when such issues arise?
Thank you. 1, 2, and then you are finished. I can say I'm pressured the same. I want to clarify the light show, let's keep it down. That's 2.
I will not spend any time on all saying when South Africa was celebrating, whatever we were celebrating, in Kenya the celebration was very different, but it was also sport. It was running. Okay? So that any sport that has to do with running anywhere in the world is always a Kenyan games. Is it possible? Is it possible that perhaps one of our challenges as scientists is we don't generally speak to one voice? Is it possible that if we really want to have science diplomacy, then scientists must speak with one voice? That means that issues and challenges and so on must be seen in the multidisciplinary approach. And then a language should be developed so that when we are communicating, we don't communicate as physicists, chemists, or whatever. That will be extremely important. That we must begin to ask ourselves, the challenges that we face, is it possible that we can have a multidisciplinary approach in handling? The second one is the language that we use. And I get worried because there is something known as the community term, and it has some letters which I seem to understand. But when I go to the village and I do a lot of memory to young people, it is very difficult for me, and I'm a scientist, to explain that to community term. So one of the kids was asking, what is it in the camera? Tell us in the camera. This is my language, Professor. And I just, is it possible for us, as people of this science diplomacy, that we must ask ourselves, how do we really have indigenous languages in communicating science?
Thank you. The last one, Professor.
Thank you.
from earlier responses. Science has not changed. Of course, come more and more sources telling us how to treat science in real affairs. But what has changed is, I think, how we use science to serve the community. And in every because of those changes, we must be ready also to make changes in how we deliver those services. So let me start with an important example. Today, my friends showed us a picture of vision. It's about 300 years ago. Science has been around since then. But the science that was available then and how it served society was slightly different. Recall that for a very long time, especially in the West, I need a few minutes to explain this. Recall that in the West, to a large extent, science was always generally a private affair. It was a private affair. The science was concentrated in industry and private academia. And then the results of discoveries and progress became commercial, and they served communities through mostly the public was never involved much. The governments didn't get involved much, and when they did, actually the results were, you have to look, for example, at the United States involvement, whenever it was involved, like the land grant, the cases, sometimes not so good, sometimes not so good, like the Manhattan Project, but they were serious with us. The point here I'm trying to make is that science was by and large mostly private until around the 60s, when we get countries like South Korea, like Singapore, starting to realize that science STI actually takes and can grow the economies. Thank you. You made a couple of minutes because this is we are out of time, totally. 1 second. The point is that science is shifting from being used by the private sector to the public. The way the public uses science and technology is it has realized that it can actually push it to use it for development. This involves public spending. This involves things like community development, SDGs and all that. Because it does, quite often the scientists who want to develop science, especially councils, they have to go to the government ask for funds. This requires the developers giving money when you want money. Thank you. But then you also have things like climate change, on a wider scale, which will also globally require diplomacy. Thank you. So I'll not talk more about this topic in the future. I haven't done justice to it. Yes. But thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Just 1 second comment, 1 second from each of the panel speakers as we close it for lunch. As we close it for lunch. We come back, we're coming back, and the announcement will be made. We will continue this subject.
You don't necessarily recognize for scientists, but I think scientists themselves need to come up more often and speak about the things where they're the word for the government talk about it, but they recognize it. But they need to tell the public what they're doing. Scientists should speak with one voice. The issue is multifaceted, multidisciplinary. Scientists rather need to learn science communication. How do we speak that everybody can understand? And secondly, scientists also have the honesty enough to admit to uncertainties so ability, the user group will be more productive. Thank you.
I think for me, I would go with the institutional backing. I think you don't know the understanding in your own mind and see recognition and I think it was an institutional backing of that. If more lectures, more recommendation of that. And I think with your in terms of being transdisciplinary and also being multifaceted, but I think also the new recognition of citizen science and acceptance of indigenous knowledge as a contribution to the mainstream science is something that we also need to accept.
2 points, but both very different. I think there's in order to second point, thank you to the politicians that raised
I think they hide for years.
the table that's so I would encourage the other avenues in Africa that if one from each of the rest see the actual observer representative who join those meetings of the other directors and formats. That way, we all those connections.
Thank you. Let's put our hands together for the panel. Here and where we go after lunch, the discussion continues. Thank you.
We are having lunch at the building to the package is looking for us. We are making the bars available for this. We are holding the package. Now, reflect with you. Your past, everything is along with you.